Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, partnership with the Hastings County Historical Society and Belleville Public Library. My name is Shannon Bryan, and I'm a librarian at Belleville Public Library. My co-host from the Historical Society today is Gary Nicol, and we are here today to hear Trevor Parsons speak about the Canadian Diaries of Queen Victoria, just in time for Victoria Day. For those of us who are joining for the first time, we'll be using the chat feature in Zoom for any questions or comments you may have. On my screen, the chat feature is located in the middle on the bottom, but it might be in a different location on your screen. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat feature throughout the presentation. I will be monitoring them, and I will ask Trevor any questions at the end of his presentation. If you experience any technical issues, if you can't hear us, if you need us to speak louder, just type it in the chat feature and I'll be monitoring that. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this along to Gary to introduce our speaker. And thanks very much, Gary.
Thank you, Shannon. As you mentioned, this is a joint presentation of the Belleville Public Library and the Hastings County Historic Society. Our presentation today is on the subject of dominions, dukedoms, and death, the Canadian Diaries of Queen Victoria. Trevor Parsons, who is a past member and director of the Hastings County Historical Society, is going to be talking to us. Trevor is a doctoral candidate at the Department of History at the University of Waterloo, with teaching specialties in modern Canadian, British, and European history. He's also an active member in the Belleville community. He's currently serving on the Glenmore National Historic Site Advisory Committee, and previously was for 5 years a member of the board of the Hastings County Historic Society, and has been vice chair of the Heritage Belleville. So we invite you to pay close attention to this presentation, and I'm happy to have Trevor speak to us today again on dominions, dukedoms, and death, the Canadian Diaries of Queen Victoria. Trevor, thank you.
Thank you, Gary. As I said, or as Gary said, it will be a discussion on Queen Victoria's diaries as they relate to Canada. But it is important to, where am I going? It is important that this occurs around Victoria Day. And that is the Queen's official birthday in Canada. But it has a really long history. So it goes back to the 1850s, when it was first recognized in the province of Canada as the day to celebrate Queen Victoria's birthday. And that's the day she was born in 1819. And for a while, it's been called by Jose Iguarta, a historian who's focused on ideas of Britishness in Canadian history, that it is the, quote, most tangible symbol, or it was, sorry, the most tangible symbol of English-speaking Canada's attachment to its British heritage. So it has a really long history, and it's not just a weekend off, as it were. And that is a photo of then Princess Elizabeth. She visited Belleville in 1951, not too long before she became Queen. And this year she celebrates the Platinum Jubilee, 70 years on the throne. So the earliest mention that of Canada in Queen Victoria's diaries occurs in October 1834, when Victoria was 15, and she writes of a visit to Colonel and Mrs. By, near a town called Frant in East Sussex, and she wrote that he, quote, showed us all of his plans of the immense work he undertook of constructing the Rideau Canal in Canada. They were 6 years in Canada and have returned now nearly 2 years, unquote. So this obviously refers to the start of the construction of the Rideau Canal in 1826, finished in 1832. Pictures you can see there. And the first time that Victoria mentions Canada as a queen is shortly a few months after she became queen. So she assumed the throne on the 20th of June, 1837, following the death of her uncle, William IV. And on the 3rd of October of that year, Canada is referenced rather benignly. It's nothing too exciting. She writes that, quote, "At 12:30, Lord Melbourne came to me and stayed with me till 5 minutes to 2. He read to me some dispatches from Canada, which are not very satisfactory." And that is 1837. So for those of you who don't know, this was a time of quite great upheaval. And we can see there a poster commemorating the Queen Victoria's assumption of the throne. So Canada in 1837 was a bit of a powder keg. Demands for greater constitutional government and a stagnating economy kind of forced the Canadians into open revolt. So writing on the 19th of January, 1838, Victoria wrote that Lord Durham, who she had just spoken with, was, quote, "amazingly pleased about his recent appointment as Governor General of British North America and Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada." He was appointed in January of that year, but left in May. Interestingly, the very next day, so on January 20th, 1838, she wrote that, quote, when the rebellion was quelled, I think is what she was supposed to write there, that in order to ensure tranquility, Lord Durham urged the Queen that it was necessary to, quote, conciliate these deluded people and to hold out mercy to them, unquote. So what's kind of fascinating about the rebellion and Victoria's reign is that in his history of the 1837 rebellion in rural Lower Canada, so that is to say what's now Quebec, Alan Greer wrote that there was little indication that the 17-year-old monarch gave much immediate thought to the political squabbles racking her North American possessions. And so the 11 entries that there are in 1837 kind of buttress this claim. But what's interesting is that the vast majority of the diary entries that I found relating to Canada, they amount to about 2/3 of the total amount, are from the year 1838. She wrote about Canada on a total of 97 different days that year. So one of them, on April 4th of 1838, she recalls discussing with Lord Durham about the burning of the ship, the Caroline, and how inept the commander who was responsible for it, Colonel or Lieutenant Drew, how inept he was. There is more references in 1838 to the border issue between New Brunswick and Maine, but she doesn't go into all that much detail about them. Again, in 1839, she talks about timber. And what really struck me about kind of just the discussions that she has with her ministers and how she recalls them is that she's very like nonchalantly talking about really important events in Canadian history. And I suppose that's because in hindsight that we can look back and say that, you know, the role of timber in the Upper Canadian economy was such of great importance, but that's only with hindsight. So yes, she talks about the duties on Baltic timber versus Canadian timber. And then the next year, she goes on about the Canada bill, to unite Upper and Lower Canada. And that wasn't really new. A lot of the discussions that she has in 1838 do kind of broach the idea of how to solve the issues that led to the outbreak of the rebellions. And 1841, and it's the same with the timber issue that I found, that she makes mention of the Corn Laws. And again, it's another kind of really important economic aspect of our history that is brought up. And the 1843, she goes into a bit more detail about the corn issue, and Robert Peel's kind of quite adamant, she says, about kind of ensuring that the Corn Law passes, and 1843 brings up a really interesting interaction that Victoria recalls in her diary, and it's quite a long one, but I think it's important to read out because it goes into detail about her interactions with a few Indigenous people who had made their way to London. So she writes on the 20th of December, 1843, and that after luncheon, quote, "We went with all the court over to the Waterloo Gallery, where we saw some very extraordinary Red Indians and fully justify their appearances and name of savages. There are 5 men, 2 women, and a little girl. They are called the Ojibwe, or Ojibwe, I think is what she intends, Indians, and there are 2 war chiefs amongst them. The one is 75 years of age and wonderful looking for that, tall, active, and upright. They were wrapped in buffalo hides with leggings and sleeves of the same, and wore various kinds of beads and ornaments and a headdress of feathers. The beads and chains gave a clanking sound when they walked. Their faces are so thickly painted with black and red stripes that no features are discernible. The old man had a necklace of fur with the claws of the grizzly bear round his neck. The squaws were somewhat like gypsy women, very high-shouldered and high-cheekboned, with black, long, fine hair and black eyes, and a spot of red paint on each cheek. They also were wrapped in hides when they arrived, but they took them off and spread them on the floor to sit down upon. The old man did the same. The women's and children's dress underneath were also composed of hide, giving quite a coarse appearance. They all shook hands with Albert, and the only one who came up close to where I sat was the little girl whom I shook hands with. The old chief addressed us in his language, saying he was ill and could not make a speech. He therefore pointed out to the second chief, a very fine-looking one, who spoke in a singular loud voice, making impetuous gesticulations. A half-caste acted as interpreter, whose father had been a French Canadian. The Indian was very eloquent about England and having come to see their, quote, great mother, as they called me. The men then went out to prepare themselves for dancing, the women and old chief sitting themselves on either side of the throne. When the men returned, the spokesman carried a little drum upon which he beat with a stick, singing or rather yelling a very extraordinary kind of song. The others dancing round and screaming, and whenever they stopped, giving a most horrid whoop, which quite startled one. They were naked down to the waist, having only retained their lower garments, but owing to their whole bodies being painted and being naturally dark, one scarcely noticed their naked skins. All the dances ended with a war whoop, and it was very curious, though somewhat alarming sight. Now that is the most kind of detailed, descriptive kind of interaction that the Queen wrote about any Canadian or Indigenous people. But it obviously made an impression on her because it is quite detailed, and it is one of the more kind of, as I said, detailed examples that she writes about. So again, she recounts just kind of the basic kind of happenings that occur in Canada. So in 1849, some of you may know that there were riots in Montreal, and the Parliament building was burnt. And the Queen wrote about that. She also wrote about the accounts of Lord Elgin, the Governor General, being assaulted. And interestingly, in 1851, she notes how she received a gift sent to her by a Nova Scotian fellow. It was she said it was a moose, deer, or elk, which apparently she couldn't identify what it was, which I found a bit funny. And 1854, again, rather nonchalantly, she talks about, and this could just be my interest because I do have kind of, I do like economic history in the 19th century. So just nonchalantly mentioning the ratification of the reciprocity deal in 1854 as just a matter of fact. But the year before is another kind of curious entry that she writes about. So in 1853, after the rebellion, it was reported to her that French Canadians were generally, quote, the most loyal people in the whole colony, unquote. Sorry about this picture. In 1856, she met a bunch of sailors, and a few of them discussed the Franklin expedition, and one in particular, a Dr. Kane, who she talked to, who was an American. He was telling her that there were survivors of the Franklin expedition, that it was only a matter of time before they would be rescued, which turned out not to be the case. So in 1858, we see the first delegation of multiple Canadians, government officials visiting the Queen. So it is a delegation of 3 ministers, George Etienne Cartier, Mr. Ross, and Galt. And she's quite impressed by Cartier. And this is another kind of curious aspect, that of all the Canadians that she writes about, she's quite explicit in how much she enjoyed the company of Cartier. So in this particular meeting, she noted how he spoke wonderful English, although they spoke in French. And this isn't Canadian, but it was in the same entry, and I thought people would just might enjoy this. So at the same time as the Canadian delegation in 1858, there's the mayor of Melbourne, Australia, and the mayor was the son of a convict, and he married a convict. And although he was at the time meeting the Queen in his robes, and talked very rationally and sensibly, but looks like a bull who could keep the gold diggers physically in order. And she also reports again of Cartier on the 7th, so just a few days after the entry I was just talking about. And so she writes, quote, that Mr. Cartier is very pleasant, very French in manner, speaking the good old French d'avant la Révolution. His ancestors came from Saint-Malo. He is very loyal, hating the Americans, who he declared could not enter Lower Canada as they found a different language and religion. Mr. Cartier, though a Roman Catholic, attended our service this morning and is very liberal-minded, which he says they all are. And she goes on to say that Albert had quite a long discussion with him as well. And because this is kind of just Canadian focused, there are a few things about this diary that are really important, that because I'm focused almost entirely on Canada, that we don't see. So the importance of Albert and her family, other historians have went on at length about this, and I think it's just important to also mention, even if it doesn't really show. So in 1860, we're skipping ahead a little, she met another Indigenous, a woman, another Ojibwe, and she was quite amazed that she writes that this lady, this Indigenous woman, Mrs. C. Sutton, she's a Christian and married, and she writes with a exclamation point at the end that she's married to an English sailor, but she is the yellow color of the American Indians with black hair, and was dressed in a strange European dress with a colored shawl and straw hat with feathers. She speaks English quite well and came on behalf of her tribe to present a petition. So in 1860, as some locals in the Quinte area might know, there was a royal visit, or supposed to be, that is to say. In 1860, the Prince of Wales visited Canada and the US. And so Victoria wrote quite a few entries just about the news that she received from the Prince of Wales' journey. So there's just a few that mention that he was received in Newfoundland, and then of a reception in New Brunswick and Halifax. She writes that the receptions were, quote, most enthusiastic but very fatiguing. More about, he visited Prince Edward Island, Quebec City, Montreal, and a letter from the Prince of Wales on September 20th, 1860, is written from Coburg, so not too far from Belleville or the Quinte area. And she actually writes about one of the reasons why the royal party didn't end up coming to Belleville, even though there was plans for the Prince of Wales to visit both Kingston and Belleville as well. But she writes, quote, the first troubles had begun. At Kingston and Toronto, the Orangemen behaved so ill, insisting on making a violent party demonstration, and actually even coming over from one place to insist upon objectionable, offensive mottos being placed on the arches, that the Duke had given them 24 hours in which to remove them. All processions were to be given up, yet they continued, so Bertie was not allowed to land at either of the places. The Duke was quite right, but it really was too bad of the people. So there was a virulent Orange Order reaction against Catholics in the province during this visit. So in 1864 is the first reference in passing to kind of the move towards Confederation. So she writes in November of 1864 that she was discussing with a British official of the, quote, great and important moving going on in my northern American colonies, where there has been a great meeting of delegates from all the North American colonies to consider the question of making a federation under one governor or under an English prince. It is principally for the object of defense. Now, what's interesting about this is kind of the or under an English prince. And this is, and this will come up again. And so I hold on that. So in February of 1865, again, it's mentioned that of the idea of letting Canada go, quote, as an independent kingdom under an English prince. Now, who, you may ask, was considered for this independent kingdom in Canada? Prince Arthur. One of Victoria's sons. He was born in 1850. And what's interesting about that is, one of the great counterfactuals, had he become king in 1867, his reign would have been quite long. It would have been even longer than our current monarchs. He lived until 1942, so it would have been 75 years. But that was not to be. So she disliked the idea that any of her sons, leaving Britain or Europe for too long, although Albert supported the idea of Prince Arthur becoming some sort of either king or permanent vice regal position, a lifetime appointment. But he actually did become Governor General in 1911. So there's a bit, so that ended up happening. So there, in 1867, she keeps talking about Confederation. She'd received a number of delegates when they met in the UK. sorry, the Duke of Buckingham, another figure who supported Prince Arthur's the idea of Prince Arthur becoming King of Canada, but that never ended up happening, obviously. So another interesting thing, and it's kind of another royal kind of discussion that occurred, was during the debate when Disraeli offered to make Queen Victoria Empress of India. There was also some discussion over whether or not other colonies should not be represented in some sort of title. And so it was discussed. Disraeli suggested that one son and another son be made Duke of Canada and Duke of Australia. So two different titles that would have kind of added greater weight of the empire in the royal kind of nobility. Another important aspect that really isn't shown, but until now that is Victoria was immensely attached to her children. She had a very close relationship with some of her daughters in particular, although interestingly enough, she really hated babies, but she ended up being quite attached to her children. As parents are, I guess. I wouldn't know. So in 1878, it was proposed that the Marquis of Lorne, who was married to Queen Victoria's daughter, Louise, be made Governor General of Canada by Benjamin Disraeli. And so in July 1878, Victoria wrote that, quote, Lorne was much pleased and anxious to accept. Louise, naturally, poor child, dreading the separation and break from everything. Heard from Lord Beaconsfield, which was Disraeli's title, much of the same, and wished Lorne for time to consider. So they ended up, Lorne was made Governor General of Canada, and Louise did end up going a little after her husband. So again, just as the royal visit in 1860, Victoria wrote just about every time she received word about Louise. So she just writes in November 22nd of 1878, she writes, Louise had gone to Canada. She writes later that week about passage through Quebec, her arrival at Montreal. And Louise ended up coming back for a little bit, but then returned to Canada. In 1879, the Queen met with Sir John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister, and mentioned that she had made him a Privy Councillor. In 1881, and I'm not sure if it was the first time, but the first time that I saw that a Canadian minister, a guy by the name of Mr. Holland from Quebec, preached a sermon at Windsor Chapel. And the Queen remarked that it was a good sermon, but that it was not a pleasant delivery. So in 1881, she keeps talking about Lorne and Louise and how unhappy Louise was in Canada. Louise did not enjoy her stay in Canada all that much, although she did enjoy a visit across the country. So there was Louise and Lorne went to BC, and they were quite happy about that, according to the diary. So in 1883, 1882, the end of that year, Louise comes home, and in 1883, Victoria wrote about that Lorne had returned to Canada, or returned to the UK after his term as Governor General had ended. And interestingly, on his first return to Windsor Castle, after he'd returned from Canada, Lorne was also there when Sir Charles Tupper was presented. Now, Tupper was the High Commissioner, so Canada's chief representative in London, and he was appointed in that year, 1883. In 1885, there's another kind of religious reference that interested me. So she mentioned after a luncheon in January of 1885 that she was presented with a Bishop Helmuth, who was a Canadian bishop, but he was originally a German Jew who had spent 40 years in Canada before returning to the UK. In 1886, there's an exhibition that the Queen attended, and she wrote about in quite big detail. So she mentions the Bahamas had a pavilion, and that Sir Charles Tupper was there, and that, quote, Lady Tupper presented me with a bouquet, but not as she wished and hoped, straight from Canada. Lady Tupper had to present the Queen with English flowers. In June of 1891, she writes about Sir John A. Macdonald's passing and how he was, quote, a most able man, unquote, who died that morning, and it was, quote, a great loss. In 1884, it's one of the most interesting entries, and it's to do with the death of a prime minister. So Sir John Thompson, Canada's prime minister, who was quite large. He was quite overweight, and that was he had heart problems. And so she writes that after she had met with Sir John Thompson at a council meeting at 1:30, and he was sworn in as a Privy Councillor, they had luncheon, and after which the Queen was informed by a physician that, quote, poor Sir John Thompson has been taken most alarmingly ill, and he had in fact died. So he died in a dining room at Windsor Castle. And she writes, too awful. It seems that poor Sir John Thompson faded at 1, and he was taken out of the room, but he insisted on returning, which he should never have done, is what she wrote. A doctor was sent for, but once he had returned to the dining room, he had a heart attack and died. So because Sir John Thompson was actually the first Catholic prime minister, the Queen sent for a Catholic chaplain from a nearby community who sort of did what chaplains do. The remains have been removed from the dining room, she said. And so a priest was sent for from Windsor, and his remains were eventually removed from Windsor Castle, although she mentions that no inquest was required, as the cause of death was quite certain. There was a short service. It doesn't say that she attended herself, but that Sir Charles Tupper, the High Commissioner, as well as Lord Clinton and Dr. Reed, attended the service. In 1897, she met, this was during the colonial conference, so beginning in the 1880s, the premiers of the white settler kind of colonies and dominions met once in a while. And they met in 1897. So she mentions Sir Wilfrid Laurier being presented, and her meetings with Joseph Chamberlain, an imperialist politician. So the very last mention of Canada is in November 30th, 1900. So just a little over 2 months before the Queen died. And she writes that of a very satisfactory visit of Canadian troops. She inspected 240 Canadian troops, along with Princesses Beatrice and Alice, and she held she had a meeting with a number of Canadian officers, including Colonel Otter, and that is the last mention that she makes of Canada. And she died in January 1901. And in the kind of the most fitting kind of way to end this, I think, is with Sir Wilfrid Laurier's remarks in the House of Commons. So this was a few months after the Queen died in June 1901. Laurier said that, quote, "I boldly say she lives in the hearts of her subjects, lives in the pages of history, and as the ages revolve, as her pure profile stands more marked against the horizon of time, the verdict of posterity will ratify the judgment of those who were her subjects. She ennobled mankind, she exalted royalty, and the world is better for her life." Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. That was very interesting. I'm going to open the floor up now to any questions that the attendees might have. But the one question I'd like to ask Trevor is, what was the most surprising thing that you learned going through her diaries? Was there anything in particular that surprised you?
Yes, and it has to do with the family aspect that I touched on earlier, and that a lot of her entries mention kind of imperial affairs and imperial kind of officials within also kind of mentioning family. So she obviously considered the empire and her subjects across the seas as an extended family, which I thought was quite interesting.
I thought that was also interesting. You mentioned that she didn't really like babies, but she had all those kids. we have a note here from Richard Hughes. He said, when Sir John Thompson died in London at the age of 49, the Governor General appointed Belleville's Mackenzie Bowell as Prime Minister. Yes, we had a talk about Mackenzie Bowell earlier. Are there any questions from any of the attendees? Openly, you can use the chat feature to send Trevor any messages or comments. Thank you very much. How long did it take you to go through the diaries, Trevor?
Well, there's about 200 pages in all. So it took quite a while. And there are almost certainly ones that the audience might have found more interesting. But these are just kind of the ones that struck me. So there's quite a few of them. A lot of them are just kind of one-liners that she read dispatches, or that the Lord Melbourne or Lord Beaconsfield said this about Canada, but a few of them go into quite detail.
Awesome. Gary has a question. Was the visit of Edward, Prince of Wales, the first royal visit to Canada?
No. Interestingly, Queen Victoria's father, while he served in the Royal Navy, the Duke of Kent, he was the first kind of royal to visit the British North America at the time, although it wasn't for very long. And it wasn't in any kind of capacity as Duke. He was just there as an officer in the Royal Navy.
I'll leave it open. Any questions? Perhaps Gary, I see you unmuted yourself. If you had anything you wanted to add, well, we'll see if anyone wants to type in their questions.
Trevor, I might ask another question. The idea of dukedoms is kind of interesting and new to me. Was it didn't happen because of the British Parliament or because of Queen Victoria?
No, Queen Victoria was quite amenable to just about anything. She it ended up just being the idea that Empress of India was quite enough. There didn't need to be kind of more dukes to represent different kind of, and there was already Canadians who were members of the nobility. So, and there were Canadians after that who were made. So there were a few French Canadian people who were ennobled under the old regime, but who had their titles recognized under the British. And there were a few others who were made baronets and kind of minor nobles. So the idea that there needed to be a specific Duke of Canada or a Duke of Australia, it was just kind of a fleeting idea that Disraeli had, and he had quite a few of them that went nowhere.
Okay, so there's no other questions that I can see. So I'll pass this officially over to Gary to wrap up. Thank you again, Trevor, for chatting with us from Waterloo today.
So, Trevor, thank you very much. There's a lot of interesting information there. And as you commented, some of it is what's not thought of. When you look at it and looking back, you kind of think what would be a comment on Canada's Confederation. It's not a lot of the information on it. Anyway, it was quite interesting. Thank you. For those that have been listening in, if you know of others that might enjoy this, it is a Zoom presentation that will be put up on YouTube, as all of us are every month. It takes a few days, but if you watch for that, you can pass that information on to others. And again, we appreciate your efforts in not only making the presentation today, but in the research. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you much, everyone. And we'll see you next month. We have another talk coming at the end of June. All right. Thank you very much. Bye now, everyone. Enjoy your day.